Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we're going live, and I am starting the countdown clock, which means that all of our viewers start to get notified at this point that,
Okay.
that we're
You get
live.
like hypnotized here with your yin yang symbol going around.
It is kind of hypnotic.
Nice,
I know.
yeah.
I made this myself,
Yes,
frame by
yeah,
frame.
remarkable. Yeah. But and as always, thank you for the opportunity to talk to your audience. Appreciate that.
You're very welcome. My audience loves you. In fact, I had a comment just a couple of days ago when somebody was very excited that you're coming on live and said, you are the very best guest on this channel.
That's very nice. Yeah, appreciate that. I'll take it while it's going.
So I'm going to take a short break. I'll be back in just a couple minutes.
Yeah.
Okay. You know, when I first saw your book, I began thinking about it, and it dawned on me really for the first time how much of my life is now involved with Apple, with Amazon, with Google, and Microsoft, and Facebook. You know, a huge percentage of my activities have to do with those 5 corporations.
Yeah, you've become a servant to them.
Well, I don't feel like a servant.
No.
But
in a way, in a technical way. No, I mean, we have to look at the positive. So, but it is, if you think about it in some ways in relation to how people spend their time, the systems work, the networks work by the way we serve them. So it is a two-way process. I agree with you. I mean, I take I take advantage of it, and we're talking because of communication technology and communicating. So I accept the good points as well, but there's a balance to be had between them. So it's true, but that force will just increase in the future.
Yeah.
And
it hadn't really dawned on me how much of my life at this point is involved with those big tech companies.
Yeah, yeah. And it is very interesting as well that because of your history in communication technology, that your persona will live as a ghost a lot longer than other people's. It's quite remarkable. And looking at your old interviews recently has been fantastic, but especially for other people who don't realize the extent of your work. Yeah, it is remarkable. It swings and roundabouts. It's, as with everything, it's about getting the balance right. So I've always appreciated the benefits of communication technology and the opportunities. But as long as we stay masters, and we'll be okay. But
yeah, well, it's very tricky. I mean, it gives us right now, you and I are half a world apart, and our conversation will go all over the world.
Yes, I appreciate that. We'll see how long they'll allow me. We'll see how long in the future the opportunities. Yes, I'm very grateful for the opportunity. So I understand, but again, it's balance, and nobody is threatened by balance, really. No right-thinking people are threatened by getting the balance right. But I'm not. I don't have a black and white view about the thing, but I think we have to state the other side of it.
Well, you know, it could so easily go out of balance.
Yeah, that's my point in all things, and I think that's where you're. I think it's fantastic that you are beginning to crystallize more your own contributions that will stand, like psychonautics and as you talked about, and they are the balancing factors for me. I think that's where it fits in. I think that's and because of its skeptic or its relationship with traditional science, it's aware of the limitations of limited scientific method as well. So it's in a good position to approach these issues.
Okay, we already have a couple hundred people online.
But that's great. Very nice.
I can see that. So we're off to a good start. It looks like we just have two moderators today, Emmy and Laura. Thank you both so much for being with us.
Thank you, Emmy and Laura. Keep all the difficult questions out.
We're getting some good questions already. I can see that. And we'll be starting soon.
Nice weather here as well at this time of year. It's nice and mild and sunny.
June is usually such a beautiful month.
Yeah, I had a lovely swim this morning up in the lake. It was great. Been swimming every day as much as I can.
Oh, how nice.
Beautiful.
And Janelle and I took a hike on the same trail that we went on with you last time you were here.
Well, say hello to them coyotes for me.
Okay. Okay, we are now officially beginning. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, and I'm here with James Tunney, who has been a guest. I think I counted, is it 18 times now?
Yes, I think, yeah.
And so we've talked about so many different subjects, but since the last time you were with me, you published both of these pamphlets. They're actually not just pamphlets, they're pretty thick booklets or books, really. TechBondAge and the Empire of Scientism. They have, I think, a different tone than your other books. Although I know you've written 2 dystopian novels, these seem a little bit dystopian as well. They're warnings. And I think what we ought to do to begin with is sort of summarize why you wrote these books and what your message is for our audience, James.
Okay. First of all, I want to say, Jeffrey, that I appreciate your platform, giving me access and having the conversations. And I think, on the record, I think you have to be the GOAT, the greatest of all time in relation to interviewers, because when people look back at the range of your work, there's nobody in the world to compare for the body of your work. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. And I mean that seriously. I think if anyone seriously looks at the issue. So to proceed from there, I did, in the context of the mystical accord, indicate that technology was the dark side, the issue which is emerging for me in the context of, if you like, mystical endeavor. And certainly in the dystopian novels, not everybody's cup of tea. A lot of people won't like them. But for example, Blue Light September, written a few years ago, I did have London in kind of lockdown with draconian legal powers, and that was the context. So it was a bit premonitionary in that sense, and that was in my consciousness, can we say. We can approach this issue from 2 ways, in both senses, whether you look at it from an intuitive, mystical perspective or a rational perspective. In both cases, for me, they lead to the same conclusion. That also, when I talked to you in January 2020, we released it in March, the interview about globalization, I said that the greatest threat to or possibility of global governance would come from scientism, and the problems that it would argue that I was going to solve would be caused by science itself. That's on the record. So that's, and to a certain extent, if you look at what has happened since then, or what was happening, it kind of mirrors in some way that concern. So in this context, I'm going to go a little bit further. My views in relation to the nature of humanity don't change about who we are. In fact, they're reinforced by looking at this concern. But the concern that I have, it's not an original concern to me, but I approach it from a slightly different perspective. I locate it in the evolution of legal principles and governance in particular, and the nature of technology itself. But I'm referring to, and I came to that of my own accord before I began to look for corroboration. I didn't start off looking at other people's views. But if you look at critics of technology, we could take the French critics like Jacques Ellul and Bernard Charbonneau. We could look at the German critics, in particular, Gunther Anders and Hannah Arendt as well. And we could look at other writers, C.S. Lewis in particular, his fears about scientocracy, or also one that's forgotten, E.M. Forster, in his essay 1909, The Machine Stops. He anticipates us living in caves, run by a machine, communicating as we are now. So that was 1909, and he was seeing futurism in operation. So I'm not claiming that my argument about the dangers of technology is original in that sense. I do argue that they didn't have the benefit of observing the evolution of governance systems that we can look at now. And even people involved in the evolution of cybernetics, like Norbert Wiener, he criticized in his essays God and Golem Incorporated the dangers associated with this as well. They were very aware of the dangers. So my argument more specifically is that now we're at the stage that we're moving into techno-slavery, into the techno-totalitarianism that Gunther Anders talked about, that we are moving into it, but that where we will face a system of governance at a global level, which has evolved through transnational spaces, which will be shorn of any commitment to human rights, will be shorn of even any idea of the individual as special. It's not a whole load of sinister people behind closed doors. There's a lot of people with particular mindsets coming from expert backgrounds, engineering backgrounds, communication technology backgrounds, governance backgrounds, who have been anticipated in various works, who will seek and are seeking governance. And if you don't believe that, if you think that I'm some kind of nutter from Ireland living in Sweden that has just invented these, we can go back to Dwight Eisenhower, his farewell speech in 1961, where he warned that public policy could be taken over by a scientific elite when he taught his famous military-industrial complex speech. I believe that Eisenhower's warning has come to fruition and that we face global governance by a combination of a security, industrial, military, pharmaceutical system, of which we will not be able to have a voice against, particularly when the advocates of this system are arguing that the human person is not important, that the person doesn't exist, that consciousness doesn't exist, that free will doesn't exist. And even when I take, for example, looking again at Donald Hoffman's argument, the case against reality, he says, which I agree with, that consciousness is fundamental. But in a key line in the book, he says, human consciousness is not fundamental nor distinctive. Now, this is where the real disagreement is. So when people are saying consciousness is fundamental and you nod your head, you have to ask what they're talking about. So the problem is this viewpoint, which we can trace back to people like Hobbes, and the idea of ratiocination, the idea that mental activity can be reduced to mathematical formulae, to a process of reasoning, and that's the essence of what the human mind is. And this is leading to an overconcentration, which threatens in its technology to effectively make slaves. And the motif of bondage, of course, bondage is a word for slavery, bond. It's there in all the ancient texts. It's there. Spinoza uses it in his work in 1677. It's from Somerset Maugham gets the idea from Spinoza, the idea that we could be in bondage to anything, to our emotions, whatever. But the reference for me from the zeitgeist was that there is a suggestion that there's been a lot of interest in things associated with bondage, sadomasochism, all this kind. It's very much in the propaganda model. It came into it very, very. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about spanking and all this kind of stuff in case anyone is disappointed. It's bad for Jeff because he has a pacemaker, so we don't want to get him too excited. But the motifs of domination and submission are very, very clear. And this is linked in some ways to Aldous Huxley, his idea that we're come to love our servitude. And I think in some way this motif, this recurrent motif, is a reflection. So instead of having the goddess of nature, we'll have the goddess in the dungeon. It's what Christopher Booker talked about, the dark feminine archetype of that. So that's the point. And in this case, I am advocating a point. I'm not saying it's right. You test, or one can test the assumptions themselves. It's different from when I'm making arguments based on spiritual tradition. I'm arguing, as you said, very accurate. It's a warning. That's what I feel. And I feel that coming from a spiritual perspective and a rational perspective.
Well, that was well put. I think it gives our viewers a sense. But while you were speaking, it dawned on me the word yoga also comes from the idea of bondage. We have our English word yoke.
Yes.
So there's kind of a very fine line.
Yeah, but it's a fine line. But here's the difference. One is a material yoke and one is a spiritual yoke. That's correct. This is the path. You can say you're going to be linked to the material world through materialism. In fact, you're going to be made into a machine. This is the transhumanist argument. So it's focused on the material world, the Ahrimanic world, if you like. The idea of yoga and of the spiritual traditions is you do, if you want to call it submit, or you do yoga, but you're linking to the highest consciousness, the thing that people say is not fundamental. They don't believe in it. So that's correct. So this is what the choice is. They're two different things. And in fact, the Enlightenment is very good at appropriating concepts from the spiritual world. The Enlightenment itself is an appropriation.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll start to take questions from our viewers. We've got many questions coming in. And here's one from Dan, who I'm pretty sure that's Dan O'Farrell, one of our volunteers. Dan asks, could the emergence of technocratic slavers be as a rising in awareness of a long suppressed self-hatred? And then he asks, are they us?
There's a concept that has been coming to me recently, and I call it machine misanthropy. So the word misanthropy is associated with a hatred of humankind. And I believe that we're encountering a deep hatred, self-hatred by humans, which is manifested in these doctrines. So that is right. There is a lot of self-hatred. It's driven by a hatred of other humans, and not just of other humans, but of other life forms. Whether you want to look at factory farming or the assault on nature, in my view, they come from a range of views, going back to this ratiocination, this view that you can dominate nature, that you torture nature. Now, this idea has been accepted by people when they're pontificating about how great science is. They ignore all the dark consequences, all the environmental destruction. I don't believe that the scientists are the ones that are going to lead the restoration of the environment, for example, because it's inconsistent with what a lot of them have done. The attack on the Amazon, the attack on farming, betrays a great hatred of the human person. So the thing that I want to put up and to re-emphasize is ideas, for example, the doctrines of personalism, from which phenomenology emerged, that is an important antidote, that we have to emphasize the human individual person, because these things are not accepted, because in the scientific and philosophical community, they're saying the human doesn't exist, they're not special, they're bad. There are many people that believe that humans should be wiped out. So reason has gone to kind of treason against the human race. And there's a certain schadenfreude there from people who are happy to see the human race and the biosphere be attacked. So yes, is the answer to Dan, and thanks for the question.
Okay, and we've got another question from one of our volunteers. Laura Newbert says, tech for convenience only. Some describe the bond to technology as pleasurable. What are your thoughts concerning that?
Well, technology is very, very useful in relation to its pleasurability. I've talked about that in Blue Lives September in relation to sex dolls and why that's because, a big industry that we're willing to love and have relationships. Well, not me personally, but that people are willing to love machinery. There is a kind of mechanophilia associated with people's love of cars and of objects. And it's a fetishism. And even people like Karl Marx noticed this commodity fetishism. And this fetishism in some way operates to take people away from the beauty of consciousness itself, from the beauty of nature. So certainly there is a lot of convenience, but as with all these things, there are costs and benefits. So people are very good at identifying what the benefits are, but then you have to look at the costs. And even in relation to the new technology, if you look at the environmental consequences of some of the new technology, it's devastating. And the same people will convey some kind of progressive neoliberalist viewpoint, which argues that they are saving the environment when they're digging up forests, they're causing diseases to spread when they interfere in natural habitats. So there's a price to pay. And the question is, for me, are you willing, is the benefits of convenience so good that you're willing to sacrifice your liberty for? I'm not willing to, personally. So yes, we all know the benefits, and people are very aware of that, but the bondage is related to our life being ruled, not just by technology, but what Jacques Ellul talks about as technique. And technique is a bond. As he says, when people are performing an operation, they know what to do because there's a technique there, an invisible technique, a bond between them that operates. So this can be as important as the technology. Yes, I appreciate the benefits, but we have to look at the price we're paying for this.
Okay, and I've got
Thanks, Laura.
A very interesting question. This is from Paul Leslie, who has been a guest on the program. In fact, Paul is a very talented psychotherapist, and he asks, if you think psychotherapy could be used to help those suffering from existential angst fueled by scientism's dispiriting of the world.
Well, hello, Dr. Leslie, and I've had a talk with Dr. Leslie on his channel as well. It's great to hear from you. Well, my challenge to the psychotherapeutic community is to look at the deconstruction of the idea of the person and of human consciousness. There is an assumption, as you know very well, that they make in relation to who the person is. This assumption is being attacked from a number of directions, particularly the transhumanist community. So the idea of who it is that you're healing and who it is that you're making whole is at issue. So I think psychotherapeutists and therapists and psychiatrists and psychologists like yourself will find yourselves engaging in this debate in future, because you're the ones who have the discipline, the knowledge, the skill, the experience to come to this issue. And I was looking at Kurt Goldstein, who developed from a kind of basis of personalism, his theory of the whole person, of the organism of the person, which he, when he came to America, was able to inform the psychotherapeutic community with. So yes, I think it's very, very important. But it requires your community to go a bit deeper and to say, well, who is it the person? Do I believe that people exist, that humans have sovereignty, that humans as individuals have sovereignty, and it's not something that can be dismissed or given away? When there are attacks from the scientific community, from neuroscience, where they deny that consciousness exists, where they deny that there's anything such as the person, where they deny selfhood, I'm expecting that some people like yourself will begin to emerge, to begin to challenge that orthodoxy, utilizing the knowledge, the skills from your own discourse. So, and yes, of course, I don't know how we can heal people if we don't have that assumption about them being a person who is, for me, part of the greatest consciousness. It's not about mathematical consciousness. It's the fact that each individual who is alive, has life in them, has that consciousness. And that's a starting point. And it's also a starting point, I know, from his work in relation to finding solutions. So thank you for that question, Dr. Leslie.
Here's a very interesting question from somebody whose YouTube name is Foolishness, who says, James, if any given government or major entity were to create a technological emergency in the modern era with many human casualties, how, if at all, can they be held to account by the community?
Well, this is a problem that came into sharp focus for me in relation to the Iraq war. And I was disposed towards the idea that international law was evolving at that stage so that it would be enforced by a kind of consensus of the international community in accordance with the United Nations Charter. And what the Iraq war showed me was that that's an illusion, that as critics have said, that there's a different law for different people, and the people that will be prosecuted for war crimes will be of a certain type. They won't be from the ruling class, essentially, in a world context. So it's a very difficult situation that we have in relation to the non-accountability. So I'm very, very skeptical about the ability of the international community, save on its own desire to preserve itself, to act against individual countries, and this is a great difficulty. But part of my argument is that it's a bit illusory to think that the nation state is as powerful as it was. Even if you look at the United States now has a lot of nodes of power controlling it outside. That's the nature of the globalized economy. There is less political sovereignty in the nation, in nations. So really, the locus of power lies in international networks. So it's very, even in the Chinese context, they're connected with a lot of other networks and dependent on some networks. So I think the problem is in the networks that have grown up in transnational spaces. I'm very, very skeptical about the efficacy of the international community and what the use of force in recent terms, in recent years, have shown is that people and states are willing to utilize force to achieve objectives consistent with their long-term strategies. One thing I would say, that the long-term strategies are probably not what most people think they are. And I did teach in international relations, which is based on an idea that individual states determine what happens in international affairs. That model, even then when I taught it, I was arguing was defunct.
We're in a world that is changing very rapidly. It's sometimes hard to see.
Thank you to Foolishness for that question. I hope I answered it.
Here's another one from Jack Patrick, who says he's reading Huxley's perennial philosophy at the moment. And Huxley touches on the importance of silence. And he would like your thoughts on the proper balance between conversations such as the one we're having right now and silence, and the work of integrating the two.
I hope, Jack Patrick, you're not suggesting that I'd be a bit more silent in this, but it's very, very important. And what I would say is that I was very, very happy at home doing my painting, starting to write in a non-academic context, very, very content. I'm very content to be out of the public eye and to be silent. I'm very, very happy with silence. I was saying to Jeffrey beforehand, I was up swimming in the lake today. It was beautiful, lovely sunny day, surrounded by the forest and lilies, etc. Fantastic. I'm very happy with silence. The problem is that, as they say about war, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. You may not be interested in technology, but technology is interested in you. The nature of technology and technological systems is that it becomes pervasive and it comes knocking on your door. You can't avoid it. You won't be able to avoid when there's great plans in the future to put nanoparticles in your bodies. There are patents being granted for that at the moment. You won't be able to avoid these questions. So unfortunately, silence for me is not an option, because I feel I have a duty to talk on some of these issues. On a personal level, I think silence is critical. And when I used to go down the country to talk to some old people in Ireland years ago, often you'd be sitting there looking in the fire, having a cup of tea in silence together. And there was no, that's a thing that people are a bit more uncomfortable with these days because they're used to being stimulated all the time. So silence is very, very critical. There's many times, in fact, I was happy to leave the lecturing context because when you're talking to people so much, you can begin to find it wearing, and your batteries begin to run low. Silence is critical. Silence is critical to reach the emptiness that all the mystics say you need to get, whether you look at it from the Kabbalistic perspective or from any other context. There is an idea of silence, or the sweat lodge in relation to Native American people. You need to go into a space that reflects an inner space to access that inner space. So there's a balance to be had. We talk too much. I get tired of because I want time to go inside as well in some context. But unfortunately, as Martin Luther King, who was very important because he studied the mystery religions and he studied personalism, and I'm sure he would have been happier doing other things, but he felt an obligation to contribute to the discourse. So there's a time for silence, and then there's a time to speak up. And I would urge people that are not in the public eye to take part. You are not mere observers in what is happening in the world. You are participants. So it's those people that think that they have nothing to say, but can see clearer than other people, that need to come forward as well, to come out from the crowd.
Beautifully put. Alex Rose asks, do you think that Western culture involvement with ayahuasca, and I'll expand that to add all psychedelics or entheogens, has corrupted the pure spirit?
I think the answer in some way is that it depends, because those traditions were there in Britain and Ireland, for example, in relation to magic mushrooms or whatever. Every culture had some access to it. What I don't like is the prospect that these commodities, which were taken in a very special context with special ceremonies in accordance with the knowledge of particular peoples, are going to be appropriated and industrialized. And those industrialized contexts, whereby they're made available as alcohol would be, for example, will be very, very useful functions or tools to pacify people, to make them content with their servitude. So that's what my fear. And I'd make this point about Terence McKenna, and I saw your interview with him recently. It's great to have those as a matter of historical record. It's interesting if you look at Terence McKenna's essay on psychedelics in the age of intelligent machines. And in that, he argues in favor of psychedelics as a prosthesis, as a prosthetic device to the human mind, in the same way that he argues for virtual reality. So as far as I can see, philosophically, he was very disposed towards what would be the transhumanist argument. And my argument and the mystical argument is that you have it already. You have the consciousness. You just have to recognize this. This is the Vedantic argument. You have to look inside you. So yes, there is a great danger that these chemical substances, especially when they're extracted, can be utilized not to give us liberation, but to make our imprisonment nicer. So when you're locked up on the next lockdown next year with the new monkeypox epidemic that spreads around the world, they say, oh, here, now we've just legalized this stuff so you can get out of your mind. And Terence McKenna talks about getting out of your mind. I don't want to get out of my mind unless I'm getting to my spirit. And the idea that you're escaping, which is also an idea which is behind this breakaway civilization, it's associated with that. It can be associated with that misanthropic idea that you escape from yourself, you escape from the earth, you escape from nature, you escape from your psyche by using a prosthetic device or chemical substances. So it can be a problem. I would distinguish people who are doing it with some connection with native people. Paul Cheka, I know, is interested, and I've talked to a lot about recently, and you have in different contexts, Jeff, about natural medicines and how they're used. But he does it with connection with the native people and licensing context therefrom. And I have a cousin who's down in the Amazon working with the people there. In that context, a bit different, but that is becoming an industry as well. Look at your own culture, look at your own place, look at what is indigenous to that place, look at the genius loci of your place and how that informs. So a qualified yes, with exceptions, perhaps, is the answer. Thank you, Alex.
Here's a question from Adriana Wallace, who says, how often do you believe the paranormal world and paranormal occurrences merge with the use of certain technologies or the amount of technology that we use?
It's a very interesting question. I'm not sure which angle to take on that. There's a number of different things that come to mind. What I would say is that I saw television coming into rural Ireland, and I saw how people responded to television. At that stage, the people that I would have known in the country were living a life that could have been a few hundred years. There was a very simple life, and then you saw this technology come in. And it certainly begins to have a devastating effect on one's ability to interpret the world, because it's a dominant force. Once you're subjecting your consciousness to such a force, it's dominant. And that was what Gunther Anders wrote about in 1956, The Phantom and the Matrix, about how powerful television was. So these things begin to disenchant the world. It makes it more difficult to engage in and to perceive the outside world if you expose yourself to too much technology. Then there's the question of, as you have talked about, Jeffrey, about how utilizing this equipment to receive information, or the electronic voice phenomenon and this. Now, my point is that we can receive, we are receivers. That's a basis of a lot of the spiritual traditions. I see it as the base of the Holy Grail, as the reception idea in the Kabbalah, the idea that we are receivers. And now neuroscience is moving, and people like Federico Fagino is talking, and he has a new book coming out about consciousness and quantum stuff, etc. And he's a person who developed a microprocessor, for example. So they're aware that we're talking about a different level of reality. I'm not as interested in personally in where the paranormal activity occurs in the technology itself, because all those phenomena in some way are available to humans. And I want to emphasize the human potential. And I wouldn't want to sacrifice that intuition that we have. Now, I don't know if that answers the question, but it's a very interesting, it is a very interesting topic. I hope, Adriana, I kind of addressed that. Send me an email if it didn't.
Well, we're actually getting a number of questions along the same line, so we'll probably come back to that some more. For example, somebody whose YouTube name is Zen Pig asks, or making a statement and wants you to reflect on it. Zen Pig says, the key to saving the environment, which we are part of, is to just use less. We think and are sold the idea that technology will save us so we can continue to be gluttons. And he would like your thoughts on that.
I agree, Zen Pig, totally with that. I think that's very important. So I agree wholeheartedly with that. And why I agree with that is because one of the greatest disruptive forces in the last 100 years has been the cultivation of material greed. And it has been part of the propaganda model of this complex, as Chomsky describes it, who are selling us something all the time, who are making us believe that we're not important. So if we de-emphasize the material thing, we get a psychological benefit, we get a psychic benefit, we get a spiritual benefit, that we begin to appreciate the richness of things that we have, that we don't need approval, we don't need social sanction for existence, that we are unique human individual people, persons with sovereignty, with spiritual capability, with capability of accessing dimensions with different degrees. So yes, the focus on making us greedy, on making us want things, has been utilized to imprison us in many senses. And one interesting point on this, my belief about globalization, I think people have misunderstood what globalization is in many senses. I believe that globalization was a tactic and not a strategy. It wasn't an end game. This is I think this will be proven in the next few years. The idea that you'll be floating around the place, everyone's going to be floating around, drinking New Zealand wine and flying off to Scotland next day, whatever. That was a tactic to destabilize the power of nation states, pending a global governance, which will not be as materialistic in that sense, because your options are going to be reduced. That's not the way I want to see it. I'd be happy if people began to see the benefits in a Zen way, if you like, as well, of appreciating the simple things and appreciating the fact that they're unique beings, they're connected with the earth, and that the earth is a great provider, and the soil, gardens, whatever, we can produce a lot ourselves. So yes, I agree.
Okay, here's a really interesting question. It seems like a simple question, but I think it's very complex and nuanced, from Big Ron, who says, do you think the breakdown of the family unit, which he attributes to everyone being an individual, means we are more susceptible to technology taking over?
Yes, I wouldn't say that it's pure individualism. Again, there's two types of individualism. I would distinguish between individualism as a material construct where you're a consumer, and individualism in the context of where you're recognized as a human person with sovereignty. So in that context, the family is a collection of different people. I come from an Irish context where family has been critical in the context of where you had various political struggles going on for hundreds of years. And I mean, they have been going on for hundreds of years in the context of what people perceived as, well, what was an empire and how it behaved. The family was their unit which kept people together. And the family is critical in relation to having grassroots in a society. So I think it's very, very important. And most of the, if you have a propaganda model, what it wants to do is to atomize people, to separate them, to make them unhappy with their present state, to make sure that they will not stay in some kind of unit which defeats their atomization. So the attack on, there has been an attack on the family, as there has been an attack on other institutions. That doesn't mean that all families are fantastic, or that people have to love their family and whatever, and there's not different things. But in relation to its unit, I think it's important. It's very, very important for me. It's the central thing in relation to my life now, and it's also a context in which I continue to grow. So yes, it's very, very important. The propaganda model that is the front of all these big industries, which are part of that materialist, naturalist, enlightenment idea, must break down opposition. And also, if you look at H.G. Wells, who wrote The Open Conspiracy and the New World Order, he talks about breaking down loyalties. It's a key thing. In order to have a scientific control of the world as he wanted, it's important to break down anything that stands in this way. So he talks about false loyalties. So false loyalty for him would be anything which would stand in the way of a scientific elite running the world for their own curiosity, in which context humans, as Bernal and other people identified, would be living in a human zoo subject to experiments. That's what the scientists have said. That's what J.D. Bernal said in his book, The World, the Flesh and the Devil. So yes, Big Ron.
Okay, these are great questions. Here's one from Michael Flanagan, who says, James, and he seems to be making a statement. You think that tech control will be invincible and inevitable when it comes. I'm not sure that's what you think, but he thinks that's what you think. And now he asks, is there not a point of ineptitude that is built into any machine, sort of like a Gödel's theorem of building in the machines itself, so that technology will never really succeed?
Thank you, Michael, for the question. I understand that, and I understand that argument, but my sense about a lot of these things are that the control of technology can be done at a very low level. You don't need to have a big implant in order to have an implant for people. If you do it on a mass scale in relation to networks, you can achieve your purpose. The question that we're talking about is how much damage can be done to humans or the human race that makes the planet unlivable, for example. So there's always going to be, and there will, at some stage, there will be resistance. I'm arguing for non-violent resistance, but there will be, if people perceive that in future, there will be different type of responses. I've been consistent in arguing that people have to be non-violent in that sense. But I think it'd be too much wishful thinking to look at the weaknesses of the system and not to understand that wherever this desire to govern people by technology comes in, there will be a greater governance technology behind it. I'll predict that you're going to see a lot more robots in your daily life in the next year or two. And you'll see a lot more new technology associated with nanoparticles, associated with control of groups through light, whatever, which is a thing that has been investigated. The problem is, if we get to what Bill Gates would call a killer application, the application of that technology may cause so much damage that it's very, very difficult to resist. And even in a country, the United States, which prides itself on protecting its freedom through the right to bear arms, a lot of the arms could be rendered useless by new technologies. The danger is that the damage inflicted by mass technology employed as a governance system could inflict so much damage that although people may survive in the end, that the damage inflicted is, bearing in mind that Gunther Anders thought, and he had seen the Nazi regime, that the techno-totalitarianism would be worse than what he had seen in Germany. And that's what other people have said from first-hand experience. So I can't be too optimistic about those flaws, but I agree with you about Gödel's theorem, etc. But that's really more about, for me, about the flaws in scientific thinking. Thanks, Michael.
Here I have a question from Catalina Lucero 24, who notices that there's been a growing amount of mainstream attention here in the United States on UFOs. Public reports about, for example, military observations of high-tech devices. And he would like to know, or she would like to know, your thoughts on the subject. Does it bear at all on the argument that you're making?
It does in a kind of perverse way. if you look back at the ancient Irish legends and the stories, the fact and reality of UFOs, it's there in European history. This thing has been going, this phenomenon has been going on for a long time. I think it was one of Jung's weaker theories about the collective unconsciousness and the projection of UFOs. That was one of the ones I found least convincing. I believe the phenomenon has been there in some context with UFOs and experience. I believe that the beings that they're encountering may be on the planet. In the context of, I've talked about in my book about light, that the light phenomenon is a experience associated with a lot of mystical experience. Funny enough, I'm very skeptical about this rash of current UFOs, and I'm very, very skeptical precisely because it's coming from government sources. And I predicted in the Empire of Scientism that you would, before this rash started, that you're going to hear a lot more about aliens and UFOs. And when I had that talk with you, Jeff, I mentioned about the Independence Day scenario, because unfortunately, what's happening is that any argument which can be utilized to argue that we should have global governance will be, and that will include asteroids. There'll be all kinds of things coming towards the Earth, which says, you need us, you need the scientists. These people or these beings could destroy us. So funny enough, I believe that if the evidence is true, that this, which I do believe is true, that people have been having close encounters for a long time, going back for millennia. If the government turns around and says, well, this phenomenon is happening, when they've been denying it now, it suggests to me that it's merely a tactic, which is part of the strategy. And the strategy is a move towards global governance, which unites capitalism and communism in the context of a technocratic regime, where as I call it, the empire of scientism unites with an ideology of scientism, which is there in both capitalism and communism. And even if you look at people like Pascal Lamy, who used to be Director General of the World Trade Organization, now they are saying, these are the people that are promoting globalism. They are saying, well, capitalism doesn't work anymore. We need a solution. They were never promoting capitalism. They were promoting global governance. That's what my belief is. So I'm very skeptical when I hear Barack Obama talking about UFOs now. I'm sorry, but I know a lot of people will disagree with that. It's not about the phenomenon of UFOs. It's why we are told by government sources now. I don't believe that they're not as forthcoming with other explanations about other things that are of pressing value to us. So I think we're being played at the moment. And the argument will be, and that's why you need this global governance that we're going to give you with your new digital currency. You can stay at home and get your doofers, your money on for your basic universal income. Everyone gets stay at home and be obedient to the new dictatorship of technology.
Okay, here's a question. I'm not sure I understand it, but I think you'll have an interesting answer. Stephanie Ramirez says, James, are the people of the world going to get their courts back? Very troubling, she thinks. Thank you, good sir.
Are they going to get their courts in the legal sense? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I should have thanked Catalina for the last question. Thank you for that, Stephanie. I believe that what I have seen in the last generation is an attack on a legal system that has grown up for 1,000 years in relation to the common law system. You take it for granted, but unfortunately you have to be vigilant about these things. So I condemn a lot of lawyers for not coming out and talking about the correct balance between repression and the circumstance that can be used and freedom. So I condemn my colleagues in Ireland for some of the stuff. I saw that the Irish bar was reported they were seeing how they could circumvent the right to trial by jury, for example. These are protections that have grown up from the Magna Carta, there for a long time, to protect against power. Legal rights are there to protect you against power in many contexts. They've been taken away. Lawyers have been steamrolled because a lot of them have become quite sycophantic to the governments in their own states. They're not very defensive of the rights. They've sat back. They've been uninformed about the threat to the very basis of legal rights. So this has happened before. For example, when the common law came to Ireland, they displaced the legal tradition that was in Ireland before. There was a legal tradition in Ireland. The first copyright case in the world came from Ireland. They had the first system for protection of widows or women and children in the context of battle, for example. There's a code from there. There was codes of compensation that were a couple of thousand years old. That system was displaced. So this always happens. I think what will, in my prediction, you will get governance. They will talk about rights. H.G. Wells talked about this. When you'd be given certain rights, they'll be redefined, and they'll give you rights which are not really enforceable. There's been a tendency now to talk about group rights, and this was the thing that came from the Soviet Union. So you don't talk about individual rights, you talk about the rights of a group. And these are no rights because they're not enforceable in the same way, or they're not as justiciable. So unfortunately, I think we're at the stage where we're losing some of these things will not be recovered unless there are strong decisions by brave judges. I'm not seeing them. I think there was a criticism in the United Kingdom that the court system was changed during the Blair government. It's a political issue, but there's an argument that the very systems of administration of justice have been changed to become more compliant. And I don't see, there used to be an idea that there were brave lawyers who would enforce rights, who would talk about the substance of the rights. I don't see them. So unfortunately, I think because people have been complacent about the nature of their rights, that they have lost a lot and you won't recover them in the same way. When you can utilize emergency powers, which have always, even in the Roman Empire, were justifiable to have a dictatorship for a short period of time. Whether this was the crisis that justified the extent of undermining of rights, I don't believe. I don't think you're getting them back in the same way. And I think they will be given over to global governance. Cybernetics is about governance, the whole idea of governance by the machine, for the machine, and of the machine. That's what's going to happen. And you're becoming a machine as well. This is what they're telling you. So people seem to be quite happy to relinquish power. Going back to the earlier issue about the convenience, you're sacrificing your freedom for some of these things, and also to the authority of science. So we may get some decisions. We may get some people wake up. It'll be too little too late in some senses. And nation states are not as powerful as they were. We may get a Supreme Court that comes out with some decisions that defends rights. I hope so, but they've tolerated a lot hitherto, and I've lost confidence in them to clarify some of these contexts. There has to be a proper balance between legitimate public health concerns and the protection of the individual. I don't see that balance.
Okay, very good answer. Chris Scarpentonio asks, what are your thoughts on all the subliminal influences in advertising today? And for example, Chris says toilet paper commercials or car commercials using family moments and relations to childhood memories for their commercial benefit.
Chris, thanks for the question. I don't have a television. I don't have a television because I want to keep myself sane. When I did have a television years ago, I began to notice that it was psychically disruptive. There's what you perceive and there's what you don't perceive. And that was what Gunther Anders talked about. The idea that you have, a connection with this chummy person at the other end that don't care about you. People forget that when you're watching television, that you are the product. And I also remember meeting a marketing guy in a big company, and he asked me about painting and he asked me about painting and what it was like when I was painting. And I was explaining to him, believing that he was asking me just in a nice way. But I noticed that what he was doing was putting me into a position so he could mirror my activity and then feed it back to me, because that's a technique that people use in order to make themselves feel, or the other person feel, better about them. And I know from talking to him that they manipulate emotions, and that's what it's about. So they get good at manipulating emotions, and it's a very, very sinister and a kind of nasty technique behind it. The propaganda model is very, very strong. You have to bear in mind an extra point that the propaganda is controlled by the people that pay the advertising. And if you're talking about, say, for example, in certain contexts, pharmaceutical companies paying 70% of the advertising bill, you can imagine what kind of psychological manipulation you have. It's very, very strong. I think not only is this manipulation overt in that context, but it's also symbolic. All the time they're taking spiritual concepts and repackaging them as things to be marketing. It's a thing that happens regularly. I can't watch television. I wouldn't watch it. And televisions I can go out the road here and look down the end of the road and see big screens. I can nearly watch it from outside. If it's good enough, I could sit down here and watch it for free. But I mean, if you're putting a child, and I'm not talking about my neighbors in case they're watching, but if you're putting a child in front of that, it's a very overpowering. And then you expect them to go out and to tune into subtle energies in nature. It's going to be very, very difficult. It's very disruptive. It's very manipulative. People are subject to this and they take it for granted. They don't believe they're being hypnotized. I believe a lot of people are actually hypnotized by their exposure to this. I mean, I'm guilty of looking at a lot of things on YouTube myself, and I'm kind of aware because I'm a bit more selective when I'm looking at following certain streams, but I understand that I'm being manipulated by the algorithm and it's learning about my behavior. I think people take it for granted, Chris, and I think it's horrific. And also, when I went to the States first, I noticed that all the ads that came on the television on the channel I was looking at, wherever it was, I think it was in Carolina, that they're all about making you feel bad, making you feel that you're missing something. And if you bought this product, well, then you'd be okay and you'd be socially acceptable. So these things have an impact as well. So I'm very cynical about the power of that and careful.
I think it's probably useful to mention that not only don't you have a television, you don't have a cell phone.
I don't have a cell phone, and I'm holding out, but I'm sure they're going to be knocking on the door here to be able to trace me for something and banging down the door. If they don't take me off to some jail for not being integrated in, you won't get a choice. These things, that's another point about the technology. It forces you to be involved in the network. They get benefits from having you in the network, and it's been difficult. I don't drive either, by the way, so I'm that's another thing. But I've managed to survive. I'm still here, so it's possible.
Yeah, you managed to come all the way to Albuquerque.
It's funny that I know some people that used to drive up and down the road and never travel beyond that, and I was traveling the world, and they say, "Well, how do you get around?" So.
Here's a question from Foolishness A, who asks about what he calls, or she calls, technological spirituality. What will become of our faith when AIs have so much insight into us that it begins to approach the level of the cities? In other words, psychic anticipation of our thoughts.
It's very, very interesting. And I did ask a question of Federico Fagino in this area of conscious agency on a Zoom call recently. And he's a person who designed Intel's microprocessor and developed the silicon gate technology that was important to a lot of the computer industry, and who had a kind of mystical experience and began to focus then on consciousness. So he's a person that understands very well this technology and understands very well the spirit. And he's convinced that the technology can't do the things that people are claiming about it. Now, I can understand that the technology is made to be so anticipatory that it seems like a city. But I think that cities are far, far more powerful in their true sense. I think they will be a simulacrum of the reality. And this goes back to the point that I believe that human consciousness is immensely powerful. And all of these arguments, all of my criticisms are against institutions which seek to devalue human consciousness, which seek to deny the power. And when you look at the better brains, they're aware that consciousness is more powerful, that it's human consciousness has created AI. Now, when we're talking about the power of AI, we're talking about that ratiocination again, the idea of a calculating power. And this is what a lot of scientists make a schoolboy error in equating with human consciousness. And I think it undermines some of the theories that they advance in relation to consciousness, because their perception of what consciousness is confined to that. The mystical tradition identifies consciousness as a more full-blown idea, which is not inferior to that machine consciousness. Machine consciousness can do computational things, other things better. It will never be able to reproduce human consciousness. It will be able to put human consciousness in a straitjacket. That's the problem. And the idea of superintelligence, Bostrom and Harari and all this idea, and Kurzweil, that we just have to give up. We have to relinquish our power because the machines are going to be more intelligent. And Kurzweil talks about spiritual machines. I don't think he's talking about the human spirit. So I have a lot of faith in the human spirit, but I've also a lot of fear, as Steiner believed, that the Ahrimanic kind of nature could be utilized to materialize the spirit, to confine the spirit. And this is a story that's there in all the traditions. It's in the Tempest, where the Ariel was confined to a tree. The idea that a spirit can be confined in a material substance, it's behind a lot of the Gnostic teachings. So, but ultimately, I understand the point. For me, that consciousness, past the Turing test and all that kind of stuff, fails to understand what human consciousness is. And scientists don't understand what human consciousness is. They may be getting nearer, they may never find it. It's certainly not an issue of computation. Okay.
Okay, I should mention it's just after the top of the hour, and we'll be going for about another half hour to the bottom of the hour.
Right.
So time flies when I'm talking to you, James. Here's a fascinating question from Sue Mosley, who notes that you describe our condition as beings in a state of servitude and bondage, and technology is weaponized to further enslave us. And this goes back now to the Gnostics. She says, do you believe our souls are trapped here prior to birth?
Thank you, Sue, for the question. I believe, just to make one point, I believe we are moving into technological slavery. I believe that we're in the entrance hall, the vestibule, if you like, moving into it. It hasn't happened yet. The same as in relation to the current pandemic and the crisis, etc. We haven't got the bill for that yet. Remember that it hasn't come yet. So that's on the way. So in the same context, the technological bits are on the way. So that's just one point. In relation to the Gnostics, there is a lot of similarity and a lot of things to learn from Gnostics. And there's some funny connections in the sense that the Gnostic ideas and same as Buddhist ideas come up to reinforce transhumanism for some people. But are we trapped when we come? No, I don't believe. I don't particularly believe we are trapped. I do believe that we are light beings which come into the flesh. How that happens is another issue. It could be consistent with the Gnostic issue I believe essentially that we are light beings, and that's what I talk about, the mystery of trapped light. How that happens is a mystery in some sense, but even in Catholicism, Hildegard of Bingen talked about the flaming light coming into the womb. There's an idea that one of my daughters, I asked her, and she told me about coming down, looking around the place to come and coming into life here. It's a recurrent idea. Whether we're trapped in that context, I don't personally believe so. I believe that you have spiritual control over your being, and the problem is when we get confused about who we are and when we begin to identify with the material world, and that's a kind of subtext too in the Gnostic literature. So I hope that answers the question, Sue. Thanks.
And moving along, I've got a very interesting question from Armando Solorzano, who says, James, do you agree with Hannah Arendt that Plato's legacy is to turn us toward the ideal and away from the world? And is Platonic religion alienating us from nature?
It sounds like you have a better view on this than I. I recently have come to look at Hannah Arendt again, and I've been very impressed. She has answered a lot of questions. She has a very good essay on you probably know about personal responsibility in a dictatorship, which is quite interesting. I found relevant in a current context. And of course, she was married to Gunther Anders, and they, of course, were in that circle with Husserl and phenomenology and all this kind of stuff. So it's quite interesting. So I would have to qualify in relation to the directness of the relationship. I'm not sure about that directness. I'd have to think about that one. I'm not really sure about how Plato's thinking and the ideal forms influences in relation to nature. Some of his views are important. The stories of air, the stories of critics of society, the stories of the individuals who want to control other people, I have found relevant. In relation to that one, I wouldn't necessarily trace it back to Plato. I think the divorce from nature was a more recent phenomenon, because when we're talking about Plato, he's a creature of his time as well. That I'm looking more at the influence of people like Hobbes and the Leviathan and the ratiocination and the 17th century, which is where people like Sheldrake as well would trace this mindset, and that was the real destructive mindset. So you could argue that you could be accurate on that, and that could be made if you had more time to fill in the links. But thanks for the question anyway.
You know, I'm glad you brought that up, because I remember reading a really good book by Al Gore on the environment, and he also seemed to blame all of our environmental troubles on Plato. That instead of listening to Aristotle, he had that famous picture where Plato is pointing up and Aristotle is pointing down. And I thought maybe Al Gore was suggesting that too much spirituality means we're not paying attention to the environment, and that didn't feel right to me.
It's also similarly where Ayn Rand locates a lot of her philosophy, and I don't think it's a legitimate basis for her. You know, Plato, Aristotle, the differences, etc. Really, we're talking about a place that was radically different from where we live today. And if Plato was alive today, he might be a computer hacker or something. He mightn't see the world in the same way. You know, he might be in charge of a tech company. We don't know. So the extrapolation from there, I'm a bit wary of. And there's also a tendency, particularly in the British Empire, to glorify everything from Greece as if it was fantastic, or to attribute significance beyond its powers that I'm a little bit skeptical about.
We're getting a lot of very interesting questions coming in now on all sorts of political topics and spiritual topics. There's so many, I don't know that we're going to get to them, but here's one from Mark Reeves, who asks, could the tensions between China and the West be manufactured, a sketch designed to slowly bring us closer and closer to this world government, or is the conflict there real?
Yes and no. The answer to the first question is yes, it could be. It could be easily manufactured because remember that Deng Xiaoping is kind of one of the creators of the modern world when he said that it doesn't matter whether you use a black cat or a white cat to catch the mouse. Now, unfortunately, who is the mouse? The mice are us. But he was arguing that the commerce could be used by communism to achieve its objectives. And that's the same idea. Now we have a lot of the capitalists talking about using communist methods or methodology to achieve its objectives. It's a big, for me, the dichotomy between communism and capitalism there's a big lie at the basis of that. Both are materialist philosophies. Both will seek to deny the human individual person. Both fascism and communism are collectivist. Both tend towards totalitarianism. What can happen, and which is what I'm predicting will happen if it goes on, is that the Chinese and the Western can work together in an empire of scientism, because they will be, the sole function will be to rule, to govern. There will be a governing elite which operates on a transnational basis, but they have the same interest: the expert class, quantification, measurement, metrics, the tyranny of metrics. They can work together. And China could not have risen to power without the support of the United States and Western governments. It was impossible. I remember talking to experts years ago, and they were talking about the rise of China, and there was a lot of people were laughing at them. I had connections with China quite early on, but if people forget how quickly it has changed. It was even, if you look back at Yukio Mishima, he couldn't figure out why the United States hadn't supported the Japanese against China. The argument could be that there is a false split. On the other hand, there are people that want to attack China and see it as a strategy. So they believe that there should be a war, there could be a war, that it would satisfy a number of objectives, that it would serve the military-industrial complex, that it might help with goals like overpopulation. There are a lot of misanthropes that have power, and so the two possibilities. But I certainly entertain the possibility that we could live in a Chinese governed system. I mean, Volvo came from Gothenburg, where I am now. I mean, they are moving, or a lot of their enterprise is now integrated into China. It's become a normal interaction. I've worked in China. I love the Chinese people. But we have to accept that the Maoist system, Mao and the Communist Party are guilty of some of the greatest murders in the history of the world, and they're not people that I want to give the remains of my liberty to, or people like that. So they could join together, and the technocratic class in the West, it doesn't matter. There's a lot of Marxists, there's a lot of progressive neoliberals. These distinctions don't mean anything. There was a lot of, you look at the people behind the Iraq war, both in the United States and in Britain, a lot of them had Trotskyist background. You can't, if it's either a materialist doctrine that wants collectivism, or it's some other doctrine that accepts that the human individual person is the most significant.
Very good. And let's see. Okay, here's a very interesting question from Fadista. Could James address the theory that the world is a simulation, and why notable people like Scott Adams are saying this more and more? It feels to Fadista like a mind virus meant to convince people not to rebel.
I don't get the last bit, not to convince them not to
I think
rebel.
Fadista is saying that the theory that the world is a simulation feels to him or her like a mind virus.
Okay. Well, the way I would, not so much. Again, if we take Gunter Anters, what he's talking about the matrix, he's talking about the propaganda model and the view of the world that is created by the systems that supply us with information. So to that extent, our view of the world, insofar as people are educated by television at home, informed by that, yes, it is a matrix. It is a constructed reality that doesn't accurately reflect the world out there, making people afraid of everything, making people fearful of the sun, of microorganisms, even though we're composed of them. All this is creating a matrix. The idea of the computer that we're living in a computer simulated environment, I don't believe that at all. I believe it's been propagated for a number of purposes. Funny enough, it's often propagated by people who propagate this matrix of which distorts our perception anyway. It's a handy way for some people to explain weird phenomenon that don't fit into the scientific model. So I'm very, very skeptical about that. I don't believe we're in a computer simulated environment. If you're in a computer simulated environment, there's some designer somewhere. Who is that designer? Well, as I said to you before, if you're a mystic, you can communicate with them, maybe. I don't believe there's anyone there. I believe that we are in a very distorted reality, which utilizes simple methods of emotional manipulation, but is using the power of mathematicians in the scientific community more and more, and behavioral science to fashion algorithms that create what is a matrix. But in relation to reality beyond that matrix, I think it's very, very real. And what we have to do is become more in touch with that reality, with the physical reality as humans as well, who are of the earth, with spiritual faculties. Thank you for these.
And this is a question from Lemon, who says, what about a period of great enlightenment? The Black Death acted as a catalyst for the European Renaissance. Can the ongoing global crisis play such a role?
You would have to accept that the present crisis is on a scale of the Black Death, for example, or the Spanish flu or whatever, in order for that proposition to be true. But if the concerns of a move towards global governance are suggestive of a greater willingness to fashion global governance out of a crisis, well then, unfortunately, no, you won't be entering into a golden era. You'll be entering into a dungeon, which is what I suggest is the fear. So where the possibility for a renaissance comes from is that if the hypnotized mass of people, and I'm sorry, that's what I believe is happening. If the hypnotized people that have been hypnotized by this propaganda model, who've been living in a techno dream, who've been manipulated by all these marketing people, who have not engaged with themselves, who have not engaged with their spirit, who have not engaged with their psyche, who have not engaged with their own needs, if they wake up and realize that there is something which is amiss, and if individuals begin to become magnetized on a mass, well, then that can happen. Or if the reaction to what becomes a clearer technological agenda emerges, the solution has to come from the spirit. And this is again a point that Martin Luther King made. I believe that the work that Dr. Mishlove does, for example, and his arguments about psychonautics and his investigation of parapsychology are affirmations of the human spirit and human potential. And that's what a lot of the work is, or Dean Radin, or any of those people. It's consistent. The positive thing that I have suggested is that to combat the technosphere, we develop the animosphere, or a concept of the animosphere, which incorporates the whole range of myth, legend, parapsychology, siddhis, religious traditions, theology, in a more meaningful and conceptual framework to directly combat the technosphere. In that sense, I'm very positive, but people have to wake up and they have to discover their own consciousness. They have to look within to solve that. It's not going to just happen like this.
Okay, and here's a related question, and it'll give you a chance maybe to expand.
Yeah, I'm fine, and thank you to Lemon for that question.
Incidentally, we've got 10 minutes.
Grand, yeah, no problem.
Remaining, and the question is from Abil Singh, who asks, are spiritual people more or less susceptible to propaganda than other people?
It's a very interesting question. And the question might be what type of spirituality that we're talking about. For example, I have seen a lot of Christians who are opposed to certain modern phenomenon, and their resistance seems to come from their religious beliefs. I believe the same will be also true in some context in Islam or the other perennial traditions. So I believe that if you are a genuinely spiritual aware person, aware that a spiritually conscious individual, aware that you are created of the highest substance or material or entity in the universe, then that you're not going to sacrifice your freedoms or give up your powers to a lesser material manipulation. It doesn't inevitably follow. And I would also say that some spiritual traditions, some spiritual light traditions, which don't have any central core of values, can be utilized to make people obedient. So I'm a bit critical of this idea that you go into yourself and shut up and just get quiet all the time, nothing else, that's what spiritual tradition it's about. I don't believe in that. Again, I'd refer to Martin Luther King as an example of someone who understood in a deeper mystical sense, and in the sense of the mystery schools, what spirit was, and believed that it was a force that had to act in the world, whether it took a long trajectory or a long arc of justice, as he talked about. So, but I would hope that a genuinely spiritual aware people would be the last to succumb to certain pressures, because they prize their spirit above other things. They prize their spirit even above their liberty or life, and that's the benefit in a way of spirituality, that you realize that your life is not ultimately determined by those forces around you. It may be horrible, they may make your life horrible and uncomfortable, imprison you, but they can't take away your spirit. Not yet, not until the new technology comes about. It could be possible to do that.
And we've got a question from Dan E.L., who asks, if materialism is man-made, aren't we railing against our own picture when we say we are threatened from without?
I don't know where the without refers to, but the materialism is a very destructive doctrine. It's dependent. It's a choice that we make by focusing on certain trends, whether it be materialism or the Enlightenment ideas of a very narrow empiricism, or ratiocination again. If we put undue weight on that philosophical approach, we will follow pragmatically to certain consequences, or pragmatically certain consequences will emerge from there. So yes, we're responsible for those and for those outcomes. It's not without in any sense. It's from our minds. That's where I've argued that the battlefield is in our minds for ideas, and that's why these philosophy should not be left to philosophers. That we shouldn't stay away from these things. We should engage in that. We should assert our personhood, our individuality, our sovereignty, explore our spirit, and refute people and stand against scientists who utilize knowledge of a very narrow mathematical concept or symbolic logician idea, who want to interfere in complex systems they don't really understand. Stand against them with proper arguments to be careful not to accept the sharp point of the materialist spear. So if I understood the question correctly, yes, that it comes from within ourselves.
Okay, well, we've got about 5 minutes left. And here's an interesting question. Adriana Wallace asks, James, what are your intentions for your future career? Any possible books coming in the near future? What is your primary passion to research at the moment?
Adriana, thank you for that question. I'm painting away. I have an exhibition down the south of Sweden in October. I think I got the date right here. But what I'm going to do until I die is to focus on two elements. The positive side is to encourage people to develop as individual persons, to develop their potential, if you want to call it psychic potential, mystical potential, spiritual potential. I believe in that. It's a fundamental belief for me, going back to the mystical accord, the basis on which Jeffrey and I started talking, and similar interests in that. That's the positive side. The dark side is to warn against mistakes that are inherent in our thinking about technology, about science, that can be destructive, and to seek from arguing with both about maintaining the balance between them. So I'm doing a series, like I'm writing as if there's no tomorrow at the moment, because I think it's important. I'm doing a series on this technology thing. I'm going to do about several pamphlets to make a case which I hope produces a coherent picture of what's happening, so people that are interested can decide on themselves. I've also nearly finished a book of poetry, which is a lot more pleasant, which I'm going to get out this year. We'll go up to the little house or shack by the lake up in the middle of the country, and I'll review it then. So there's a positive and negative side. There's a balance in both. I'm going to focus on that issue because I think it's critical. I think I have a duty to do so. I have children, and I don't want them to ask me in the future why I was silent on these issues if I understood what was happening, where it can directly impact on them. So they go hand in hand, but I don't want to be too depressing in this. I'm not saying it's a fait accompli. I do believe that the straitjacket is very nearly readily fastened. We're getting to One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where we'll be talking to Nurse Ratched behind the glass in that story, and the Combine is taken over with their fog machine. It preempted a lot of these issues. So I'm going to try and be positive, but this series about technology is the dark side for me, and it brings in everything from Prometheanism to Satanism to what all those issues are there, and people can make up their own mind. But bright side, mysticism, poetry, painting, and the dark side is technology. And I've actually abandoned a lot of other issues to concentrate on that. I'm going to do that for the next year or two until I can write no more and I say my piece, and that's what I intend to do.
Well, this has been a wonderful conversation, James. I have to applaud you for your insight and also for the many other activities that you're able to write these books and paint and write poetry all at roughly the same time and have a beautiful family to boot. It's a wonderful demonstration of balance. For people who want to reach out to you, you mentioned they could send you an email. You want to give out
on the website, www.jamestunney.com. I'm not on any other social media website, but if they send me, I'll respond to people that email me. I've built up a connection with a number of people that watch your shows, and I'd say hello to all them lovely people and some very interesting connections. So I appreciate that, and I think this is an important part of the positive thing, where people of goodwill, good nature, exploring their spiritual identity, can talk above and from their experience, from different perspectives, where we can seek, as I was saying, a mystic murmuration. So I want to thank you, Jeff, and I reiterate that I'm very, very grateful. I'm very, very grateful that you entertain views that you don't have to agree with. You don't agree with necessarily. So I respect the fact, and I think other people should recognize what a broad base you've given to people. And as I said, I do believe that there isn't a greater interviewer in the world. And when they talk about Joe Rogan and that, he's only a Johnny come lately compared to someone like you, who has in the work that you have done over the years, a remarkable body of work. So I just want to put that on record. So I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you, and I don't take it for granted. So thank you.
Well, it's an honor to be with you, James. Every conversation is one that I learn a great deal from. So
thank you.
Let me just mention before we close that we do have a weekly newsletter on the New Thinking Aloud channel. You can subscribe for free by going to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation, which is New Thinking Aloud, ALLOWED.org. And thank you all for